Hello, you are listening to Trump Republic Radio. It is September 7th, 2017. I am your host, Enzo Quesada, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, Bobby Hester.
Hello, everyone.
And this week for the Midweek mini podcast, we got a pretty good show that we've been doing a lot of prep work for. I've spent probably like 8 to 10 hours on like the research just on my part alone. I don't know how much you did, but
probably 2.5 or so.
so about an equal amount of work. But yeah, we are doing what I'm calling the 2017 Global Conflict Report or Conflicts Report. We are going over 24 different global conflicts that are happening right now, with all varying of severity. Some of these have been going on for decades. Some of these have only been going on for a couple years. But this isn't even every single conflict that's going on in the world, but these are the most profound ones that are happening.
These are ones that are mainly based on armed conflicts. So there are a lot of different conflicts going around the world that not necessarily people fighting, but are obviously conflicts that are happening.
All of these have had militant actions on all sides.
That's pretty much the basis of what we're choosing to actually go off.
Everyone has a death toll of at least like 1,000 or a couple thousand,
or pretty close to it.
Yeah.
Some of the more recent ones have less than 1,000, but we'll get to those when we get to those.
Yeah. Do you want to just go straight into it now, then, though?
Yeah, we have this organized by region. So the first region that we're going to go over is the Middle East.
Yeah, and you got the first one here with the Iraqi Civil War.
Right. So the first thing that we have is the Iraqi Civil War. It began, legally, it began January 1st, 2014, and it started when the Iraqi insurgency, which was happening after the U.S. troops pulled out, I believe in 2011 or 2012.
Around then.
When Obama finally pulled them out, there was the insurgency that started because that pretty much created a power vacuum in the state of Iraq there. But that then escalated into a civil war with the conquest of Fallujah, Mosul, and Tikrit, as well as other areas in northern Iraq by ISIS fighters in the region. And currently, the fighting, or if you're wondering who's on each side, ISIS is fighting against the Republic of Iraq, Iraqi Kurds, Iran, and the Combined Joint Task Force, which is known as Operation Inherent Resolve, which includes the United States, France, the UK, the Netherlands, Australia, Jordan, and Denmark. And this has been going on since 2014, and currently, Iraqi forces have recaptured the city of Mosul and Tal Afar in the north, and they also control most of the country in the south. The Kurds almost completely control the entire northern area of Iraq, but ISIS still controls pockets along the western border as well as the city of Tikrit, which is pretty much one of their last holdouts in northern Iraq. And it's estimated that there are between 53,000 and 72,000 people that have been killed in the last 3 years since the conflict started.
It's kind of crazy because this is all just because we didn't have a plan to what to do with Iraq after we invaded. Taking the country of Iraq wasn't that difficult in the long run for us, but we just weren't prepared for any sort of long-term game, and we weren't prepared at all for the insurgency that grows up.
I was going to mention the insurgency is the most important part. I know people like to make fun of President Bush when he was on that aircraft carrier that said mission accomplished, which, I mean, that banner had to do with the actual aircraft carrier itself, not the mission of Iraq. But that being said, the initial invasion was pretty successful. It was after we stayed there and the insurgency started that really made us realize we have no plans of being here. I mean, I personally am on the side of we never should have gone in to begin with, but the way that we left is what created that power vacuum, because we left so suddenly and rushed it because the population of the country did not want the war to go on any longer. But, because of that power vacuum, you have 53,000 to 72,000 killed in 3.5 years. So you really got to be careful with what you're doing.
Yeah. Now, as we've been reporting on the regular Sunday show, ISIS has been in great decline, especially with the recent capture of Mosul, and also just in Syria. They're at the doorstep of Raqqa. They started to invade the city, but the city hasn't been captured yet. So
right,
it's going to be interesting to see what happens in that power vacuum of ISIS leaving.
Right, and I know this podcast is audio only, and I wish I had a visual diagram to show, but if you can imagine a map of Iraq and Syria next to each other, you can kind of, they are next to each other. If you imagine that border that's between them, draw a big circle with that border running directly down the middle, and maybe extending a couple 100 miles in each direction. That's pretty much what's left of what ISIS really controls in the area. I know we're going to get to Syria here in a second, but that's pretty much, if you can imagine, that's what we meant when I said that ISIS controls areas along the western border of Iraq, as well as the eastern border of Syria.
Yeah. Want to just head into the Syrian Civil War then?
Yeah, that was my segue. So I guess I'll go over this one then. The next thing that we have on this list is the Syrian Civil War, which began March 15th, 2011. Now, this started during the Arab Spring protests. Enzo, you know about those, right?
Yeah, it was the social media kind of revolution that happened all across the Arab world. A lot of the wars that we're talking about on this list right now are because of the Arab Spring, and it engulfed the entire region and changed everything pretty much in the region.
Right. So the Syrian Civil War started because of that, where different groups in Syria that were upset with Syrian President Bashar al-Assad started to pretty much fight back against the government.
It started with just protests.
It did start with protests, but it quickly escalated into violent conflict.
Yeah, Assad started firing into these protests, and eventually the protests started arming themselves, and then it was a full-scale civil war.
Yeah, see, this happened back in 2011. I remember in high school watching live streams of those protests and actually literally live on camera watching people get gunned down by Assad's forces. It was quite an interesting thing, especially since I was in school when it happened. I had a browser that allowed me to bypass the school security to watch live streams on Twitter. So I remember when this all happened. And
when the Arab Spring started for me, I was on a cruise ship to Cozumel. So it was interesting, I was just eating a bunch like you do on cruise ships, and on TV I'm just watching protests in Syria, protests in Egypt, protests in Libya. It was like the world was collapsing and while I was indulging. But yeah, let's go into some of the belligerents that are in Syria at the moment.
So what's interesting about the whole thing in Syria is there's really four sides that are kind of fighting against each other at this time. At first you have Syria itself, which includes the Syrian Armed Forces, the National Defense Forces, and Ba'ath Brigades. And you also have Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia, who are helping Syria as well. Now, they are currently fighting against the Syrian opposition, which is more commonly referred to as the Free Syrian Army, as well as Turkey, who supports the Syrian National Army. And you also have ISIS, who is fighting both of those. And both of those sides are fighting ISIS as well. And the fourth group you have is Rojava, as well as the what I mentioned before is the Combined Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve, which is the same thing that's helping with Iraq, except here you have the U.S., France, the UK, Netherlands, Jordan, Germany, and Norway, who are all involved in that. So you have those four different sides all fighting each other. Now, I know people said that the U.S. has helped train different rebel groups in Syria, and recently President Trump said we're not doing that anymore.
Yeah, once the Syrian Civil War started happening, we had groups like al-Nusra start up, and for a while under Barack Obama, we were, aiding those rebels, giving them arms and training them, all because, they're fighting Assad. And then we started, only funding rebels that were fighting ISIS, but a lot of the guns that are out there in Syria are our fault. But just to mention Rojava, since you brought that up, right. Rojava is a independent Kurdish nation that is not recognized by all nations currently, but it is in northern Syria along the Turkish border. And when we get into the Kurdish-Turkish conflict, we'll get more into that. But yeah, what are some of the current boundaries that are out there in Syria in the conflict?
So currently, if you can just imagine a map of Syria in your brain, the Syrian government controls most of the center of the country. But the Syrian opposition forces, like the Free Syrian Army, they control different pockets here and there in the southern region, as well as a big pocket in the northwest of the country near the Mediterranean Sea. But Rojava currently controls the north along the border with Turkey. So if you can imagine, again, like I said, the a map of both Syria and Iraq, Rojava is part of that Kurdistan there, and the Kurdish people then control that whole northern area there along that Turkish border, which has also led to conflicts along the border with Turkey. But ISIS controls, like I said, a stronghold along the Iraqi border there in eastern Syria. So you can imagine, like I said, pretty much a circle around that border with the border directly down the middle. That's ISIS's stronghold. Now, the death toll for this has been a lot higher than Iraq. Since it began in March of 2011, there's an estimated between 332,000 and 475,000 people have been killed. So that's an extremely high number of people.
Yeah. Actually, one thing that we're going to be mentioning on Sunday is the Syrian army itself has broken the siege that ISIS has had on the city of Deir ez-Zor. So, that's another case where ISIS is on the retreat in Syria, and as I just mentioned before, they are attacking the capital of Raqqa. So again, it's interesting to see what is going to be the power vacuum once ISIS is out of Syria. I mean, I'm assuming that probably the Syrian government's going to take most of that territory.
Yeah, and it does seem like the Syrian government has been making a lot of headway recently with victories all over. So it seems, at least to me, that, obviously I'm not going to say how long I think this is going to continue as a conflict, but the Syrian government's I think they're pretty much going to win in the end. I don't think they're going to lose at this point.
Yeah, but as far as conflicts currently happening this year, the war in Syria has had the highest death toll.
Yes.
Do you want to go into Afghanistan now?
Yeah, you want me to do this one?
Yeah.
Okay, so the next thing we have, everyone in the U.S. should be very knowledgeable about this one. We got the war in Afghanistan, which began October 7th, 2001. It started when the U.S. demanded that the Taliban in Afghanistan hand over Osama bin Laden after 9/11, and then they ended up launching an invasion, which was later joined by other forces. Now, this is the longest war in United States history. It's going on like almost 17 years now. In fact, in a month from today, it'll be 17 years. Now, the belligerents currently are Afghanistan, the United States, Italy, Germany, Georgia, Turkey, Romania, the UK, Australia, Czech Republic, and Poland are fighting against the Taliban, which includes the Islamic Jihad Union and the Haqqani Network, as well as Al-Qaeda groups in Afghanistan there. Now, there's been a lot of fighting ever since then, but currently the most updated thing we have there is when President Trump made a speech changing U.S. policy to focus more on defeating terrorists instead of training the Afghani forces and nation building, which is pretty much what we've been doing beforehand. We were playing a supporting role for the last several years, but it looks like now we're moving more towards an active goal of kind of what our whole mission was to begin with, was to wipe out the Taliban and different terrorist groups and jihadi groups in the region. At least that's from the United States' standpoint. You had something to say about that?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it is important that we stop focusing, I think, on trying to train the Afghan forces. I mean, we've been trying to train them forever, and they just can't stand for themselves. Have you seen, like, the videos of us trying to train these guys before?
Yeah, it's like watching children.
They're really pathetic. And also, a lot of times these guys, one, run away when they go into a battle, but two, a lot of times, if they're any good, they would get recruited out of the Afghan forces to go fight for the Taliban because they pay more. And also, there's just a lot of instances where, there's a bunch of guys signed up in the Afghan forces that are receiving payments that just aren't there. And also, just the Afghan forces are pretty bad, and, like, there's a lot of, like, widespread, like, officers using children and stuff as, like, sexual slaves and whatnot, so it's not good.
I was also going to mention a lot of the Afghan forces that get mad at the U.S. have killed some of our guys in friendly fire incidences as well. So, but anyways, there is between 52,000 and 67,000 people that have been killed in the war in Afghanistan since 2001.
Since 2001?
Yep.
Because we also have here the cumulative fatalities, and it ranges between 1.2 and 2 million people.
That also goes back a little bit farther,
Yeah.
including Afghanistan's pretty much always at war, and that number includes going all the way back to like when the Soviets launched invasions of Afghanistan back in like the 70s or 80s. So if you're focusing just on the U.S. war in Afghanistan since 2001, it's 52,000 to 67,000 killed.
Okay.
But I guess we'll move on to the next one we have, which I guess I wrote down here, which was the Yemeni Civil War, which began March 19, 2015. It started when Houthi forces, which controlled the capital, and allied forces that were around it, clashed with forces that were loyal to the government. And you currently have 3 different sides that are fighting each other, and those include the Yemen Supreme Political Council, which includes the Houthis, the Republican Guard, and different pro-Saleh security forces, as well as Iran and Hezbollah. They are fighting against the Yemen Hadi government, which includes Al-Islah, the Popular Resistance, and the Southern Movement, which are the names of different groups. As well as they're getting help with the Saudi-led coalition, which includes Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Morocco, Egypt, Senegal, and Sudan, as well as receiving support from the United States. And both of those groups are also fighting against ISIS, who's the third group fighting, and their ISIS group there is called Ansar al-Sharia. Now, currently, the Houthis control if you imagine the country of Yemen there on the Saudi Peninsula, if you were to break it into 4 equal size quadrants, just 1, 2, 3, 4, the Houthis control the far western quarter of the country, and the second quarter and the far eastern quarter, which I guess you could say would be the fourth quarter there. Those 2 are both controlled by the Hadi-led government, but ISIS is mainly in control of that third quarter, as well as a very small section of the southwestern coastline. So it's almost perfectly split up 1, 2, 3, 4, with those 3 different groups controlling their areas. Now, the Yemeni Civil War, which I said began March 19, 2015, it's believed there are between 7,700 and 16,200 people that have been killed in the last 2 years since that began.
So the thing that you need to keep in mind with the Yemeni Civil War is, 1, this is the poorest nation in the Middle East, but 2, when you talk about the Houthis, they're a predominantly Shia organization, which is why Iran backs them, because Iran is the largest Shia nation in the world. And that's also, plays into why the Saudis are so invested in Yemen, because they are, the largest Sunni nation in the world. So this is a big proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they're both investing in different rebel groups in the area. And, if you know anything about how we sell weapons to the Saudis, we sell a lot of weapons to the Saudis, and they use a lot of those in Yemen. So, we do, directly aid into the conflict that's happening there in Yemen.
And we also conduct airstrikes. That's how we also do it, too.
We also do that. But, yeah, it's really bad out there. It's almost, you could consider a failed state. Which, you could consider Iraq a failed state as well, I'd say.
I consider Iraq a failed state.
Yeah. But
let's move on to the next one here. This one I think you had.
So I got the next one. Yeah, this is the Turkish-Kurdish conflict. It began on August 15th, 1984. This is between the Turkish government and its Kurdish minority. Now, we just mentioned earlier the Kurds have Rojava. That is the only Kurdish state. If you think about the diaspora of the Kurds, because the Kurds are their own people, they're a nation. They're a nation without a recognized nation state. But there are a lot of Kurds in the I guess what you'd say, the southeastern portion of Turkey. There's a lot also in Syria. There's a lot also in northern Iraq. There's also a lot in northern Iran. They're spread all along that area. But in Turkey, the start of the conflict was due to Turkish suppression of the Kurds. They didn't allow them in public or private to speak their language or practice their culture or customs or anything under violent suppression. So the Kurdish Workers' Party, which is abbreviated the PKK, it's under different letters for their language, but they started an uprising which, involved them taking terrorist actions all across Turkey. They've been doing this for decades, and currently the Kurds have accused the Turks of allowing ISIS to cross into the Turkish border so then they can go south into Rojava to fight Rojava. So there is accusations of Turkey is aligned with ISIS because they both want to kill Kurds. But yeah, as of this moment, there's considered upwards of 45,000 people killed in the conflict between the Kurds and the Turks. I just want to look up a quick thing here.
Well, yeah, while you're looking that up, I'll just reiterate kind of what I said earlier. If you imagine that map there of Syria, Iraq, and Turkey above them, where the Kurds control northern Iraq, northern Syria, and then along that southern border of Turkey there. So that whole kind of region along that border of those three countries, that's really Kurds' stronghold there. So
yeah, the one thing I just wanted to look up to be sure on is the Kurdish Worker Party was founded by Abdullah Öcalan, and it is essentially like a Marxist-Leninist organization, which is also interesting because in Rojava, their government is considered libertarian socialist, which I guess you could technically say is anarchist, not anarcho-capitalist like a lot of people think of what anarchism is, but more in the traditionalist sense of what anarchism is, more in the lines with like the Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. So what they do in Rojava is essentially there's no taxes. The only tax that they have out there is like a land-based tax, and they use the oil from there to fund all the public services, and it's a very egalitarian society, backed through their Marxist Leninist kind of backings. It's kind of an adopted ideology which has been formed by Abdullah Öcalan. It's interesting if you have interest to political theory and such. But yeah, that's the conflict between the Kurds and the Turks. Let's go into the last thing we have for the Middle East.
Okay, so the last thing we had from the Middle East is not the biggest one by death toll, but probably the most famous one of all, and that is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, this technically started in 1964, although the Jews in the area, as well as Palestinians, have been at odds with each other for thousands of years now. So,
well,
technically, yes.
You could say yes, but this has to do more so with the formation of Zionism as an ideology.
Right, which is a lot recent.
Yeah.
But that being said, this one began 1964, and it's between Israel, and they're against Hamas, the Islamic Jihad, as well as the Gaza Strip. And it started really when the Jews that were occupying the West Bank and Gaza Strip, after the removing of Palestinians that were there, and that's led to resistance from both sides. I know you know a lot about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict as well.
I do. So you got to look back kind of long term before even the foundation of the Israeli state. I guess a good place to go back would be to World War I. The nation that we call Israel today was considered the Palestine territory under the Ottoman Empire. Now, when we say a Palestinian, that is kind of a new conception because there hasn't been a nation ever called Palestine. And there hasn't really, until recently, been like a group identity towards Palestinians. At that time, they were just Arabs that were in the region. Not to say that they weren't there before a lot of the mass migration of Jewish people into Palestine. But, I bring it back to Zionism. It was the belief that the Jews need a homeland and that they wanted to restore Israel as their homeland, that they had back in biblical times. But since then, they were a diaspora after they were expelled by the Roman Empire. So after World War I, Palestine was mandated to the British. Iraq and Syria, that went to the French, but the British were given, Palestine. And actually, or never mind. The Balfour Doctrine, which was actually written prior to the finish of the First World War, was the British government agreeing to work towards the creation of a Jewish Palestinian state. So once the British controlled Palestine, they started bringing in a lot of Jewish migration into Israel towards their furthering of the ideal of, creating a Zionist state. So, they started coming in by the tens of thousands, the Jews, and they started having conflict with the Palestinians there already. So the British tried to hold off for a while on the migration. But then we have World War II, and, the Holocaust happened. And after the Holocaust happened, there was even greater desire for the Jews to have their own homeland because they didn't feel safe being in European nations. So you saw an even more massive increase of migration into Palestine, which brings you up to about 1948 when the United Nations resolution came out to create Israel as a proper state as we see it today. Now, at the United Nations declaration resolution 1948, they created both a Palestinian and an Israeli state. Territory is allotted to both of them. And then Jerusalem was supposed to be an internationally designated territory since it's, home to the birth of pretty much, it's a holy site for both Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. So they wanted to recognize it as kind of a neutral territory. But then, immediately once Israel was formed as a nation, you have the first Israeli-Arab War, which Israel won. And then you can follow that into the second Arab-Israeli War, which happened in 1967. And this is where Israel started taking a lot of territory. They took a lot of the territory of Palestine. They took the Sinai Peninsula. They took the entirety of the West Bank, which was allotted to Palestine. They took the Gaza Strip, which was allotted to Palestine. They took the Golan Heights in Syria. So all of a sudden you have this massive growth in territory by the Israelis, which led them to make an agreement in the United States called the Camp David Agreement. I believe that's the correct agreement's name, which ceded back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt and it started to define different areas for Palestine more so. But that's when the spur of the PLO started to really be, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That's the, I guess you could say, terrorist or nationalist liberation front that is currently fighting the Israelis today. But that pretty much leads us to where the current boundaries of Israel and Palestine are, where the Palestinians have some territory in the West Bank, some in the Gaza Strip, and some in Jerusalem.
And you know what? That perfectly describes where I was going to say where the conflict is today. Israel does continue to try to create settlements in Palestinian territory, which then leads to backlash from Palestinian groups in there, including Hamas and other jihadi groups that are within the Palestinian areas there. But the most recent death toll we have is as of 2011. We don't have anything since then. But since 2011, we have 9,500 deaths as of then. So
yeah. Kind of crazy I could give all that history just off the top of my head.
You're very good at it.
Yeah, I've read way too many books on Israel. I have Netanyahu's book, Israel and Its Place in the Nations. I've read the whole book. It's pretty good.
Nice.
But let's move on to Europe now.
So the first thing that we have in Europe is the North Caucasus insurgency. Now, the Caucasus region is the region there in...
The Caucasian Mountains.
Right, the Caucasian Mountains, which are in Russia right now.
Some is in Russia.
It extends down into Azerbaijan and...
Armenia,
and pretty much that whole region by the Black
Georgia,
Sea.
stuff like that.
Yeah. So the insurgency started following the end of the Second Chechen War, which ended in 2009. And after that war was over, different militant groups that were associated with the Caucasus Emirate, which is kind of a jihadi type group that's in that same region, and they began fighting government forces that were there, as well as other groups that were in the area. And right now you have Russia, which includes Chechnya, Dagestan, let me see if I can pronounce this, Ingushetia, as well as other loyalist groups to the Russian government. And they are currently fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS, who are allied with the Caucasus Emirate. Now, currently, the amount of fighting has declined a lot in recent years, although because if you remember when we had mentioned earlier when we were talking about Iraq and Syria, how ISIS's territory has been pushed back to where they don't really have very much territory anymore. However, that's why they've kind of looked to expand into other countries, not just in Iraq and Syria. And ISIS is currently looking to expand their territory in that area there of Russia.
So the region that we're talking about is actually, it's very different than most people's conception of Russia. Most of the people out there are of Tartar descent, which is like Mongolian essentially, and they are religiously Muslim. Now, the biggest region as far as the conflicts there have been going has been in Chechnya, which Bobby has said there's been 2 wars that have been fought in Chechnya ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, which a lot of the conflicts that we're going to be talking about in this list are former Soviet territories where the ethnic conflicts have arisen from. But yeah, the Chechens are the most pronounced area of radicalization. You look at jihadist groups all across the world and, jihadist fighting, you can find Chechen fighters everywhere. And also in the inverse, you can find jihadists going into the Northern Caucasus area on the behalf of their fellow Muslim brothers. Now, I think it also is good to take perspective on just the general fighting between the Russians and the Chechens. There's been several terrorist attacks against the Russians on the behest of the Chechens. The first one that comes to mind is the Moscow theater hostage crisis, where around 170 people were killed back in 2002. The second one that comes to mind was the Belsen school siege that happened back in 2004, where around 385 people were killed. So the Chechens are really hardcore, radicals, because they've been fighting for their independence for over, 20 years, going on 3 decades. So that's where a lot of the source of the violence is coming from and continues to this day.
And currently, the death toll since April of 2009, when the North Caucasus insurgency started, between 2,200 and 4,100 people have been killed.
Yeah. Let's go into the other conflict that we have for Europe, which is the Ukrainian Civil War.
You've got this one.
This is a conflict I'm pretty well versed in. It started back in 2014 after the Maidan Revolution, where Yanukovych, the president, was removed from office, where the area where the fighting is happening is in a region called the Donbass, which is in eastern Ukraine.
Now, does that extend down into Crimea as well?
Crimea is a separate matter in itself. Crimea is currently annexed by the Russians, but the combatants that you see in the Ukrainian Civil War are the Donetsk People's Republic and the Lugansk People's Republic, which are both pro-Russian separatist revolutions, or separatist forces, you could say. They're both pro-Russian, and they're tacitly endorsed by the Russians. Sometimes the Russians do help them out. There have been reports that they've found like Russian forces on the front line with these guys. But, the Russians don't want to start an all-out war with the Ukrainians. It's bad enough they've taken Crimea from them. And then, of course, you have Ukraine on the other side. Now, as I said before, this started in the wake of the Maidan Revolution. You have to look at what was happening at the time. Yanukovych promised that he would further economic connections with the European Union, which, the economic situation in Ukraine is pretty bad. It's an extremely corrupt nation. But he turned his back on what he said he was going to do, and he kind of more aligned with the Russians, which caused a lot of revolting to go on in Kiev, which is where, the modern revolution happened. He was dispossessed. But Yanukovych was actually voted for by, in the Donbass by both the Donetsk and Lugansk. So they decided that, we don't want to be part of Ukraine at all. I mean, ethnically, most of the people out there are Russian. Most people speak Russian in that region as opposed to speaking Ukrainian. Ukraine is a very, very intricate and diverse nation as far as ethnicities and languages go. So, currently there is still some fighting going on. There's been various attempts at ceasefires, but they've all failed. They're still fighting today, and there's been around 10,000 people killed in the conflict so far.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
So, I guess with that, we'll move down into Africa, which there's a bunch of stuff here in Africa.
Yeah.
So, the first thing up, you've got this one, I believe.
Yes. The first thing that we have here is the Somalia Civil War, which began in 1991. Now, the Somali Civil War began as a resistance to the Said Barre military junta, which controlled Somalia since, I believe it was 1964. The people revolted against him because of the failures of the war that he had with Ethiopia over the Ogden region of Ethiopia. You have to keep in mind, Somalis are their own ethnic people. They're a diaspora of themselves. So they're not only limited to Somalia, they also bleed into Ethiopia and Kenya. So, Barre, he saw fit to invade Ethiopia after, he enacted all these socialistic policies. He was aligned with the Soviet Union, and he felt, enough power to try and go take back his people in Ethiopia. He was also funding, separatist forces in Ethiopia. But during the conflict, the Soviet Union actually switches sides and starts backing the Ethiopians, and then the United States starts backing the Somalis. The United States was giving them, the Somalis, around, I'd say, like $100 million a year, while the Soviet Union was backing the Ethiopians to a tune of about $7 billion a year. So the Ethiopians won that conflict, and in the failure to win the war, the entire country just grew into mass resistance, and there was an absence of a state since all these rebel groups were teaming up against the Barre ran government. So currently what we see in the Somalian Civil War, we have the federal government of Somalia, which is not much of a government to speak of. They do have some control of some territories. Occasionally you see Kenya has, in the recent years, invaded into Somalia to try to create a buffer zone with Somalia, because it does leak out into them sometimes. You also have Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, which has been fighting in Somalia since around the 80s or 90s. They're the biggest terrorist group in the region. And you also have Somaliland, which is an unrecognized country and which is formerly Italian Somalia. That essentially there's no conflict going on there at all. They run their own government independent of the nation. And then you have the different autonomous regions all across the country that the Somalian government, allows them to be autonomous. But there hasn't been a single government to rule over the entirety of Somalia since 1991. So there's been a very long civil war, and in that time since 1991, around 500,000 people have been killed. So definitely on the more brutal sides as far as wars go.
I bet. So in the same region, just a little bit to the west of that, you have one of the newest nations on earth, which is South Sudan. Now, they broke off from Sudan back several years ago. But this is called the South Sudanese Civil War, and it began December 15, 2013, when President Kiir, spelled Kiir, of South Sudan, and his deputies attempted a coup d'etat, but fighting then broke out between different warring factions over control of the region. Now, the different belligerents of that group currently right now are South Sudan, which includes, their government, their military, etc., as well as the South Sudanese Liberation Movement and help from Uganda. Now, the second group that's fighting is the United Nations Regional Protection Force, as well as Rwanda and Ethiopia. And the third group that's fighting is the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in Operation, which is sometimes abbreviated the SPLM-IO, as well as the South Sudan Democratic Movement and the Nuer White Army. Now, currently as it stands, the South Sudan government controls the north, the south, and the west of the country, and the SPLM-IO controls different pockets along the eastern border, as well as extending into the middle of the country itself. Now, since this fighting began back in 2013, there have been estimated 50,000 to 300,000 people have been killed.
And this has been going on since 2013.
Yeah, so
that's a lot of
years.
people killed in a short period of time.
Very much so. And the next thing that we have up on this list, I think I've got this one, right?
Yeah, you did.
The next thing we have up on this list is the Libyan Civil War. Now, this all began kind of after Gaddafi was killed, and military forces started assaulting bases of Islamist militia groups, and they vowed to not stop until those militias were completely wiped out. And once they did that, the different militia groups then began to fight back and recruit and extend their own territory as well. Now you have the country of Libya, which includes the Libyan National Army, the Justice and Equality Movement, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates. The second group is also from Libya, but this includes the Presidential Guard, the Libyan Navy, Tuareg militias, Tubu militias, and the Amazigh militias. The third group up, which is also Libyan, is the Libyan Shield Force and the Libyan National Guard. They're also helped by the Shura Council of Benghazi Revolutionaries. And the fourth group, which is relatively new to the conflict, is ISIS. ISIS is one of their biggest strongholds outside of Syria and Iraq is in Libya. Now, currently, as everything goes, the Libyan National Army has defeated the remaining Islamist militia forces in Benghazi, but since ISIS came in a couple years ago, they've been using the instability of the country to try to gain more territory. Now, I'm going to backtrack a little bit as to why the military forces began assaulting the bases of those Islamic militia groups that began the whole conflict. A lot of it was actually in direct response to the terrorist attack on the Benghazi consulate back on September 11, 2012, where the whole, Hillary Clinton, Benghazi, all that sort of stuff.
You could talk forever about.
Yeah.
So it's its own podcast in itself.
Yeah, but it was kind of in response to that, about a year and a half later, that's when military forces started going after those Islamist groups that were there. So even this kind of has to do with U.S. foreign policy a little bit.
This has to do with the power vacuum we created after we took out Gaddafi, which was pretty stupid.
Yeah.
I mean, Libya is a failed state. So is Somalia. I guess you could say Sudan is as well. A lot of failed states where these conflicts are.
Yeah. So for the death toll there, the most updated numbers we have are as of December 2016, and it's estimated it's right around 5,700 people have been killed there.
It's not as costly as some of these other ones, but I mean, there's nothing out there.
Yeah. So the next thing that we have on our conflicts report list is the war in Darfur. Now, this began back in 2003 on February 26th. It was a lot bigger during the Bush administration, but it's kind of winded down since then to a degree. But it began when Sudan, and this is in Sudan, by the way, Sudan Revolutionary Front forces began fighting the government because of the oppression of the non-Arab population, and the government then started fighting back and started an ethnic genocide cleansing of the non-Arab population in Sudan. Now, there are three sides that are fighting each other. There's the Sudan Revolutionary Front, which is helped out by South Sudan. The second group is the Sudanese Armed Forces, which pretty much is the Sudanese government. And the third force you have is the United Nations African Union Mission in Darfur. Pretty much what we have currently going on is, there's been an ethnic genocide that's been happening since 2003. And peace talks have repeatedly failed, even though fighting itself has kind of been winding down. Now, it's estimated that there are roughly 300,000 people that have been killed since 2003.
Which is a ton.
Yeah, and most of that has been the ethnic genocide, not actual fighting between forces.
Predominantly civilians.
Yes.
So let's go into the next thing that we have here, and that is the Boko Haram insurgency, which began around 2009. Now, what you have here is Boko Haram is an insurgent group that has been fighting against, it's predominantly in northern Nigeria, but it's also leaked into Cameroon, Chad, and Niger. But this all started from a religious sect started by Muhammad Yusuf. The name Boko Haram itself roughly translates out to Western education is sin. So what Boko Haram is, it's a Wahhabist, Salafist, sort of radical Islamist sect that, takes its Sharia law very seriously. And for the first 7 years of existence, there wasn't really any fighting. They just started withdrawing from society and being their own religious sect. But in 2009, the police investigation led to the arrest of some Boko Haram members, in which Boko Haram started taking some retaliatory attacks against the government itself, and that's where the insurgency has spread out to be. Now, currently, Boko Haram has been severely weakened, and now there has also, as of 2016, been some infighting amongst their leadership. So it's now been reduced to some villages around Lake Chad and the Sambisa Forest, which has always been the base of Boko Haram itself. But there has been a rise in child suicide bombings. In the first month of 2017 alone, there has been 27 in Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, and Niger. Last year, there was only 30 altogether, and there was 56 in 2015, so there is an uptick in that.
Yeah.
In total, though, since 2009, there's been around 47,700 casualties as per the insurgency.
Now, okay. Yeah, I was going to say. I guess we can then move on to the next one then?
Yeah. So much in Africa.
Yeah, so the next thing we have up is the Kivu conflict. This is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It began in 2004 when forces began clashing with the government after believing that the government committed different war crimes. They claimed that is the forces were trying to stop a genocide, but the UN denied that claim as well. And then soldiers began fighting back with the help of other African countries. There are really three sides fighting here. There's the Democratic Republic of the Congo Armed Forces, who are allied with pro-government militias, including the countries of Angola, Zimbabwe, Burundi, and the UN mission in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They are fighting against the Democratic Forces for the Liberation of Rwanda, and the third group is the Alliance of Patriots for a Free and Sovereign Congo. So all three of those sides kind of fighting against each other. Now, like I said, this has been going on since 2004, And currently, the DR Congo Armed Forces have really actually mostly been victorious, but they're still working on pockets of rebels throughout the country. Now, the death toll here is massive. Okay, since 2004, it's believed that over 1.6 million people have been killed in the Congo.
That's crazy.
And if you remember back when I said it started because the forces against the Congo government claimed that they were trying to stop a genocide, and even though the UN has denied the claim, 1.6 million people killed, that's almost genocide type numbers, you know. Normal, regular, like militias fighting each other doesn't really lead to 1.6 million
like
killed.
that.
So it's estimated that, yeah, there probably has been genocide that's been going on within the Kivu conflict itself.
Yeah.
So,
Do you want to go into the next one now?
yeah, this one's yours.
So the next conflict that we have is the Lord's Resistance Army insurgency, which began in 1987. Now, I think most people will be familiar with this. You'll know it by something else, though, which is Coney 2012.
Coney 2012!
Which, the invisible soldiers and whatnot happening there. Well, that's what this conflict is. The Lord's Resistance Army was started by Joseph Kony as a break-off from a movement called the Holy Spirit Movement, which was going on during the Ugandan Civil War, where this conflict takes place for the most part. The Lord's Resistance Army is currently fighting against Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, and South Sudan. The entire organization is a cult of personality around Joseph Kony, where he is believed to be a god on earth, so to speak. They're renowned for their usage of child soldiers, their use of rape as a weapon of war. At one time, they were funded by the Sudanese government, which is where they got a big backing, where they got a lot of their weapons, as long as they fought on the side of the Sudanese government, which is why they started moving into the South Sudan. The fighting has kind of died down some, but it's still going on. They still continue to have pockets around the different countries. But as of March 30th, the United States has actually decided to end their actions against the Lord's Resistance Army. But since 1987, there has been over 100,000 people killed in the conflict.
Who knows how many of them were child soldiers, too?
A lot of them. And it's not to say that the Ugandan military is good either. I mean, they do a lot of, war crimes as well. It's just a bad situation out there in general.
It seems like everything in sub-Saharan Africa leads to just problems all over the place.
Yeah, a lot of war crimes all across the continent.
But moving on from Africa, we're going to go into Asia. We have a couple of things here to begin it. So the first two conflicts we're going to mention here are actually kind of intertwined, but we're going to mention one before the other. So the first thing we have up is the Moro conflict, which is in the Philippines. This began back on March 29th, 1969, with the Jabida massacre, where 60 Filipino Muslims were killed by the Filipino government, and that sparked an insurgency which has led to multiple jihadi groups trying to fight for control of the Moro region. Now, the Moro region is kind of in like the big island at the south, well, the big island in the southern Philippines. The northern area of that island, that's pretty much where we're talking about for the Moro region. Now, as it currently stands, the belligerents are the Philippine government, which is also supported by the United States and Australia, and they're fighting against jihadi groups including ISIS, Bangso Moro, Islamic Freedom Fighters. Those are the two that are there. Now, currently, as it stands, multiple groups have actually expressed peace officers with the Filipino government. However, the ISIS groups themselves have continued to fight. And about 120,000 people have been killed since 1969. Now, that leads into the more recent thing we have, which is the Marawi Siege, which is also commonly known as the Battle of Marawi.
Which we've talked about many times in the Sunday program with
have.
Chris Solera as well, who's Filipino, who has family out there.
Yeah. This began back on May 23rd, 2017, so just a couple of months ago. And this is directly the Philippine government versus ISIS. The U.S. Well, I'll get to that in a second. And this started when the Philippine government launched an operation to try to capture the leader of ISIS in the Philippines. But ISIS then responded to laying siege to the entire city of Marawi. And currently, I mean, there's been fighting ever since, as we've talked about kind of on the show, to where it seemed like the Philippine government was almost going door to door trying to wipe out ISIS fighters for a while. But ISIS has been pushed back into just a small region of the city. What I read, it's only like a few square mile block that ISIS actually has full control over that hasn't been totally liberated. But they're occupying buildings, including mosques. And I guess the way it stood was the Philippine government didn't want to bomb holy sites, which included mosques.
But last week on the Sunday show.
Yes, which is where I'm getting to. The government has now given their Air Force permission to bomb the mosques directly because the ISIS fighters knew that they wouldn't get bombed in there. Well, now they're going to get bombed in there. And it's been estimated that in the last couple months alone, 900 people have been killed during the Marawi siege or Battle of Marawi. So it's quite the conflict in that little town. Or not really a little town, but in that city.
So the next conflict that we have here out of Asia is the Kashmir conflict, which began in 1947 as per the partition of India. The belligerents in this conflict are Pakistan and India. Now, it is a territorial conflict over the region of Kashmir, which both Pakistan and India claim to have sovereignty over. When India was initially getting partitioned, you look at that time period, it is the biggest period of mass migration in the history of the world. You had millions of Muslims heading to Pakistan and from India, and you have millions of Hindus traveling from Pakistan to go to India because they generally did this on religious terms. But Kashmir was allowed to choose where it wanted to go as far as partition went, but immediately pretty much Pakistani forces invaded the region, and then India invaded the region as well. And since then, there's been 3 different wars in Kashmir, the most recent one being in 1999. Currently, as it stands, Pakistan and India split the control of the region 50-50. There's been occasional border fights, terrorist attacks, and protests throughout the region, and just a lot of instability. But ever since 1947, there's been around 44,000 to 47,000 people killed in the Kashmiri conflict.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but if you look at like a map of the world and you see India and Pakistan, it seems there's always like a dotted region between the two. That is the Kashmir region, correct?
Northern India.
Yeah, so you can pretty much look on any map and you'll know exactly where that region that we're talking about is. So I guess that moves on to the next one, right?
Yes, which is also in India, and that is the Naxalite Maoist insurgency, which began in May 25th, 1967. Now, the two sides in this are the Indian government itself and the Naxalites. Now, the Naxalites are a Maoist, Leninist, political far-left group, which is trying to fight on the behalf of the poor people in India. They get their name from the far-left uprisings that emanated out the village of Naxalbari in West Bengal. So that's where their namesake comes from, and that's when the insurgency began. As it currently stands, the Naxalites have a presence in 60 districts in 9 of India's 25 states, and they're conducting sporadic ambushes of Indian security forces. It's been described, the Naxalites, as the biggest security threat to India itself. Ever since the insurgency began, there's been around 13,800 people plus killed in the conflict.
Wow.
That brings us to the next thing that we have, which is Myanmar, or you might know it as Burma, and the conflict that has been going on there since its inception as a nation in 1948. This is what is considered the longest civil war currently going on in the world between the Myanmar government and over a dozen different ethnic rebel groups. You have the United Way State United Wa State Army, the Kashin Independence Army, the Karen National Union, and plenty of others. But the conflict started when the United Kingdom gave independence in 1948, and when they were forming the government, the Barmar majority in the nation pretty much took all control of the government and refused to allow any other ethnic groups to have a say in the government. And they pretty much just see every single people that aren't Barmar to be like a slave population. Now, this conflict has been really, really bad as far as like human rights have been concerned. There's been a lot of targeting of civilians. There's been a lot of uses of landmines. The entire nation is just filled with landmines. And since 1948, there's been around 130 to 210,000 people killed, and there's been over 1 million people displaced. Currently, the fighting is continuing as it is now, with occasional rebel forces going on offensives, but there's no end in sight anywhere soon.
And then that leads us to the very last thing we have for Asia.
Yeah, so. Which I also have, and that is the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, which began in 1988. Now, Nagorno-Karabakh is a small, unrecognized nation between Armenia and Azerbaijan. Now, the conflict started towards the fall of the Soviet Union. You had perestroika going on under President Gorbachev, and with that going on, ethnic tensions in the region started to rise up again. The Armenians and the Azerbaijanis, ethnically and linguistically, aren't that dissimilar from each other, but they religiously are. The Armenians are Orthodox Christians and the Azerbaijanis are Muslims. So for a while they were able, in the Soviet Union, to put their ethnic differences aside, but towards the end of the Soviet Union, there was a rise in nationalism once again, and that led to a full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan once they gained their independence. Which displaced around 400,000 Armenians and 850,000 Azerbaijanis. Now, the fighting as it continues today, geopolitically speaking, Armenia is backed by Russia, and Azerbaijan is backed by Turkey. And also, Armenia is backed by Iran. And then Azerbaijan, I believe, is also backed by Saudi Arabia. So there's like a lot of engulfed interests in this conflict around Nagorno-Karabakh, which is a small region. Which, if you look at how the fighting has been going recently, it actually seems like there is like an uptick in violence right now. There's been on and off peace deals and ceasefires that have gone on since the conflict began. But, the Nagorno-Karabakh region, as far as the fighting has gone, it initially was a region populated by Azerbaijanis, but once, people started being displaced and the Armenians started started winning in the war, and they were able to establish Nagorno-Karabakh as the unrecognized nation it is, it's a predominantly Armenian nation. But, as of 1988, there's been around 28,000 casualties.
I think you mean
conflict.
Since 1988.
Yeah, since 1988, there's been around 28,000 casualties.
It's incredible. So the next region that we are moving on to is North America. Thankfully, we only have one in North America.
We only have one in North America.
So I'll let you do that one.
And that the one area of conflict that we've identified is the Mexican drug war, which is interesting because, it's the only drug war that we have on the list. It's not actually like anyone trying to take over the government per se, but the belligerents, as far as it goes, you have the Mexican government allied with the United States and Colombia, the three big anti-drug forces in the hemisphere. And then the other side, you have all the various different cartels in Mexico, and there's tons. And I can't really even name them all, but I'll go through just some of them. So you have the Sinaloa cartel, which is generally considered the largest cartel in Mexico. That is the cartel that El Chapo was formerly a part of. Then you have Los Zetas, which is widely considered the most violent cartel. They don't really deal in drugs as much as they do deal in arms and extortion and kidnappings and such. Just between the Sinaloa cartel and Los Zetas, they have around 100,000 armed members. So that's an army alone. But then you also have the Gulf Cartel, Los Caballeros Templarios, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, the Juarez Cartel, the Beltran Leyva organization, La Familia Michoacana, and there's plenty more. And there's even smaller gangs all around the area. Right now we are seeing with the drug war there, the balkanization of a lot of cartels into smaller gangs, which is actually making it more violent because a lot of the smaller gangs don't have the infrastructure that you need to have large-scale drug trades, and it's kind of now breaking into more turf wars. So the Mexican drug war began in 2006 under President Felipe Calderon. Just looking at the Mexican drug trade itself, the industry produces somewhere between 13.6 and 49 billion dollars a year. Mexico controls 90% of the cocaine that goes into the United States, 80% of the meth, and half of all heroin. So when President Felipe Calderon left in 2012, they did some polling on how the Mexican population feels about the drug war going on. 66% of Mexican citizens believed that the cartels were gaining in strength despite, fighting for the last 6 years. But also 52% of Mexicans supported the government in its fight against, the drug cartels. Now, you look at how Mexico stands, it's near a failed state at this point. The corruption is so widespread, and the cartels control a lot of the government, so...
And I just wanted to interject one more statistic. You might have gone on to mention it, but I do want to make sure it is mentioned that if you look at the death toll of every single country on Earth in 2016, Mexico was the fourth highest in the world, behind Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. So that's just how bad the drug war actually is.
Yeah, and then after the Mexican drug war is the Somalia Civil War, just to put it on a frame. Like, the Mexican drug war is currently more violent than the war in Somalia, and they have Al-Shabaab out there.
Yeah, and even then, it's not too far behind the war in Afghanistan. So
no. So, it's interesting just kind of guessing where this is all going. They have President Nieto currently, who he became president in 2012, but he's going to be a one-term president. He doesn't have intentions of running again. So there's going to be a new government in 2018. I don't know where this is going. Add along with what Trump is looking to do with creating a border wall. How is that going to affect the drug war? I don't know. But as of 2006, there's been between 104 and 144,000 people killed, and 28,000 people are currently missing in Mexico because of the Mexican drug war.
I don't want them here, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I definitely want a wall. This is something that they don't talk about on TV. Like, one of the most deadliest conflicts in the world is just south of our border. Like,
fourth largest deadliest conflict in the world.
Build us a wall and protect us from that, okay?
Yeah.
You think it would just make sense, but no.
So the next thing that we have up is down in South America. And the first thing that we're going to mention, I've got this one, is the Colombian conflict. Now, this is also largely drug-related, at least in more recent years, but it didn't really start that way. So it actually started when left-wing guerrillas and right-wing paramilitary forces started fighting each other in order to try to gain control of territory within Colombia, and that then led into the Colombian government getting involved, which then led the different forces and guerrillas and paramilitary groups to try to get money and arms and stuff, and a lot of them did turn to drugs. So when you had a lot of drug cartels down in Colombia doing their sort of stuff, that's where you had guys like Pablo Escobar and all them. They earned a lot of money, and that money made its way into guerrillas and paramilitary forces. But the three main sides that are fighting is the Colombian government, which has help from the U.S., Spain, and the U.K. And they're fighting against the first side, which is the right-wing paramilitary forces, which include the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the Alianza Americana Anticomunista, the Black Eagles, and Los Rastajos. And the last group here is the left-wing guerrillas, which include the National Liberation Army, the Popular Liberation Army, and FARC. Now, as it currently stands, FARC actually signed a peace deal in 2016, ending their role in the nearly 50-year-long conflict, but fighting between the other forces still continues. And as it stands, since 1964, there are over 218,000 people have been killed in that fight.
That's quite a lot.
Yeah. Now, you've got the last one here for
South America. Yes. The last conflict that we have in South America is the internal conflict in Peru, which began in 1980. Now, this has been primarily a conflict between Peru and Shining Path, which is a Maoist political group that was started out of Ayacucho, which is like a rural area in Peru. Now, in 1980, the Peruvian government was going through some land reforms. So a lot of the resources in the country were being diverted towards that. So a lot of resources weren't being put into Ayacucho, which kind of led to the resentment, which led to, the Shining Path to gain some power. There's another group also, the Tupac Amaru Revolutionary Movement, but they also fought the Peruvian government and Shining Path, but in terms of kills and whatnot, they're only about 1.5% of the entire conflict, so they're not much to talk about. But the Shining Path, as far as the political movement went, really asserted itself when they refused to take place in the 1980s election. Instead, they started going to polling places and burning ballot boxes and started open conflict with the Peruvian officials. What they believed in, I gotta look up their leader's name, but they followed the same model as Mao, where they wanted to create liberation zones all across Peru. So they divide the country into different zones, take out the police, military, government officials in that area, and then they try to move on to create more liberation zones, recruiting out of those liberation zones until they could liberate the entire state of Peru, which didn't happen. But they used a strategy where they tried to focus on rural areas, and then they wanted to choke out the larger cities. The government stationed out of Lima was their primary target. The Shining Path was created by Abimal Guzman, who is a professor in a university out of Ayacucho. But initially, because throughout Peru they have a history of coup d'etats, the president at the time of the 1980 election didn't want to get the military very involved because that would cede more power to the military. So they backed off on it for a while, and the Shining Path was able to gain a lot of power throughout the 90s until President Fujimori became president. And Fujimori, put his foot down and said, "We're going to stop this stuff." Fujimori went all out. He absolved the Congress. He changed the Constitution, but on top of, pretty much like ending democracy in a sense, he had support of 72% of Peruvians.
Wow.
So, the Shining Path was definitely a big problem. Now, since Fujimori's presidency, the Cheyenne Path is nothing like it was in the 80s. But you still see sporadic terrorist attacks by Cheyenne Path here and there. But since the conflict began in 1980, there's been around 70,000 people killed.
And that leads to the very last region that we're going to talk about, which is Oceania/Australia.
Which is just Oceania in this case.
Yeah,
but,
so we just got one thing, thankfully, and then we'll be out of here.
Which is the Papua conflict, which is out of New Guinea, which began in 1962. The belligerents in this one is Indonesia and the Free Papua movement. Now, in 1962, the Dutch left West Papua, New Guinea, and the Indonesians moved in and annexed the region. Now, under the New York Agreement, which was signed in the United States, they allowed Papua to have a vote, a plebiscite, on their independence, which they held in 1969, but it was highly rigged against the natives. Only about 1% of the natives in the region were allowed to vote, and yeah, it was a rigged election. So, since then, Indonesia has controlled the region, and the Papua natives have accused them of trying to genocide them. The Indonesian government has encouraged a lot of its different ethnic minorities, especially the Japanese, to move out into the Papua region. So they're trying to displace the Papua population that's there, alongside them trying to kill them. And as it currently stands, the Papua people are now a minority in their own homeland. So, since the beginning of the conflict, there's been around 150 to 400,000 people killed. The insurgency continues today, although as recently as of March 24th this year, 154 guerrilla fighters surrendered to the Indonesian officials. So things for the Free Papua movement have been going so well, and maybe they'll never gain independence, but there continues to be an insurgency on their behalf to this day.
It's a shame that they've become a minority in their own lands. I mean, that's got to be terrible.
It's pretty messed up.
Yeah.
But, yeah, that is all 24 conflicts that we have for the 2017 Global Conflicts Report. It was definitely a mouthful to get through and a lot of research to do, but I think it was a pretty good one.
I think so as well.
And with that, we still got the Sunday show. We have a new guest who's never been on the show before with YCT that will be coming on Sunday. So we haven't had a guest on in months, so I guess stay tuned for that.
It's going to be interesting.
But yeah, with that said, I hope you enjoyed our little report we did for you. I definitely enjoyed doing it myself. Do you enjoy it, Bobby?
Oh, I did, very much.
Yeah. Well, once again, thank you for listening, and have a good one.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.